My name is Mary Hannick, middle initial F for Florence, and I was born April 10th, 1909 in Chicago, Illinois.
Okay.
So that makes me what? 98 years old.
98, there you go. All right. So you were involved with the Red Cross.
I was overseas at the American Red Cross in France and in Germany during World War II.
Okay, well, go on, tell us all you want.
Well, I was working at Eastman Kodak Company as a personnel counselor, and I got real involved with the war movement. I was very impressed with it. But I didn't want to join the Army. Got in the Army, I'd probably get kicked out because I was telling them what to do. But I went over to the Red Cross. The Red Cross at that time was on Troop Street in Rochester. And I was introduced to a Veronica Marr, who was director of the Red Cross. And she talked with me about what I said I wanted to go overseas, definitely. I didn't want to do domestic Red Cross, I wanted to go overseas. So she took my application and gave me a doctor's form that I had to fill out and told me who the doctor was I had to go to. So I went to the doctor and had my physical exam, and I was fine, except that I weighed 98 pounds. So they sent the letter down to National, and National wrote back and said they were interested in having me, but I had to weigh 108 pounds to go overseas. When I weighed more, when I weighed 100, I should write and get in touch with them. So I drank a lot of milkshakes and ate a lot of food and finally got up to 105 pounds and wrote to them and told them I'd gained. I didn't say how much I'd gained, I just said I gained weight. So they sent me a letter telling me what time I was to come down to New York and where I was to stay and where I was to come for the appointment. So the day that I was scheduled to go in for my appointment, I wore a dress with a lot of pockets, and I filled those pockets full of stuff just in case they ever weighed me again. But they never weighed me again. They accepted me there on the spot, and I came back to Rochester, and I have in my bag here, I have a letter telling them my approval of appointment and telling me when to report to American University for 4 weeks training. And that's what I did, and I took a leave of absence from Kodak. So I went down to Washington, was there for 4 weeks, and then they sent us overseas.
Where did you go first?
First I went to France. We landed in Le Havre, France. We were 10 days on the ocean. There were 2,400 GIs on board the ship I was on, 300 officer personnel. I have a note here in the book, but I can remember mostly. 40-some American Red Cross personnel on the ship. And the day that we got off the ship to send us into Paris by bus, we were the first ones off the ship, the American Red Cross people. And as we walked down the gangplank to get off the ship, the GIs are all lining the decks and they're yelling, "You'll be sorry, you'll be sorry." So that was our farewell to the 2,400 some GIs. Then they drove us up to Rouen, France. Rouen is where, and they had the Joan of Arc Red Cross Club, and that's where Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in Rouen, France. And then from Rouen we went into Paris. And I can't tell you, first I have to tell you it was bitter cold. And they gave us each a blanket to wrap around ourselves in the buses. And then as we realized we were in a war-ravaged country, as we started out in that bus, all we saw was devastation, just devastation, complete devastation. But in some areas it was interesting to us that people had covered over the floor of their houses and they were living underground in their houses. And the children were delightful to wave to as we rode along. And then just before we got into Paris, we all saw the Eiffel Tower. And then it really hit us that we were there. And so then they took us to Red Cross headquarters and assigned us to our hotels that we were staying in. Now, the Red Cross had taken over a lot of hotels wherever they had Red Cross people. And that sounds fancy, but hotel living wasn't fancy during the war. You had a bed and a shower and a place to eat, but no fancy hotel stuff. And so I was assigned to a hospital in Paris, and I was there for quite some time. And then I got notice that I was to go to Marseille, France. So another Red Cross worker and I got in on a truck, a Red Cross American truck that they sent to send the Red Cross people to the railroad station. We were on the railroad overnight to go to Marseille. That's another whole story, but I don't want to go into that. And then we got to Marseille, and Red Cross assigned us again to hotel billets. And we were assigned to the hospital in Marseille. And I really want to tell this story about being in Marseille. It was Christmas Eve, it was Christmas time. And Christmas Eve we went through the hospital, we sang carols and we had gifts to all the patients. We wrote letters for those patients who couldn't write them. And then in every place where there was an American installation, they hired civilians from that town to work in the installation. And so we had gifts for all the French civilians who worked there. And then we stayed at the hospital overnight because the next morning we had so much to do. So we had sent an invitation to the orphan asylum that was right next to our hospital. Now today they wouldn't call it an orphan asylum, they'd call it a group home. But back then they were still called orphan asylums. And we had sent a letter to the orphan asylum asking the nuns who ran the orphan asylum if they would bring the children over for Christmas dinner on Christmas Day. And they wrote back saying they would be very happy to. There'd be 44 children ranging in age from 4 to 12, all girls, and 2 nuns. And so we got busy wrapping up packages. The American Red Cross had sent us knit scarves, caps, and mittens, and we made a package for each one of the 44 little girls with also a bar of chocolate. Now, if you were in the ETO during World War II, there were 3 things that you could use for barter: cigarettes, chocolate, and nylons. If you had any of those 3 things, you could get almost anything you wanted in the ETO. But anyhow, we made a package for each child and a package for the sisters. And around 1 o'clock, we sent the ambulances over to pick them up. We traveled, wherever we went, we traveled by ambulance. And we sent them over to pick up the children, the nuns. And they arrived, and what French gibberish was going on, English gibberish. And Sergeant Phelps was tall like Matt is, and he was a little bit lighter weight than Matt, but just tall like Matt. And he and Nicole, 4 years old, spotted each other the minute Nicole walked in that door. She bounded right over to Sergeant Phelps, and Phelps knew immediately that she was his partner. He hadn't seen his own little girl for quite some time. So he picked up Nicole and walked her around and helped her open her package. And then we asked the men to bring the jeeps over from the motor pool, and they rode the children round and round the compound. Then about 3:30, we said to the men, take the children over to the mess tent and get them ready for dinner. But I can't find Phelps and I can't find Nicole. They've disappeared. So I walked over to the mess tent, and pretty soon Phelps comes in carrying Nicole. Mary, did you know she doesn't have any socks on? No, I didn't know that. She's got bare feet inside those shoes. I took her over to my tent. Now you can imagine Matt's foot. He said, I cut down a pair of my socks and I sewed them up and I put them on her. She's now got socks inside her shoes, and I've got 12 pairs of socks here to give to the sisters to see what they can do with them. Phelps, that's lovely. Now sit her down and get her something to eat. So he took Nicole over and sat her down on the bench in front of and the tables looked so pretty. We never had white tablecloths, but while our company clerk had gotten white tablecloths, we never knew. We had white tablecloths and candles and fruit on the tables. So he set her down on this bench, and he went and got her a plate of food. He brought the plate of food back, and he put the plate of food down in front of Nicole. Nicole looked at the plate of food, and she looked up at Phelps. Now, if you ever have a 4-year-old in your life, they're the bossiest thing in the world. They can boss everybody around. So Nicole looked at her plate of food, and then she looked at Phelps, and she shook her finger at Phelps. She said, attende. In other words, pay attention there, mister. And he did attende. He paid attention. So she reached in her pocket, and she brought out a handkerchief. She brought out a toy. She brought out a hair ribbon. Then she reached way, way down to the bottom of her pocket, and she brought out a half stick of American chewing gum. There was nothing French children loved more than American chewing gum. Wherever they went, wherever we were, they'd follow us down the street. S'il vous plaît, kagame, s'il vous plaît, kagame. We'd always buy gum and the PX to give to them. So she took her out her half stick of chewing gum. She looked at the half stick of chewing gum, and she looked up at Phelps, and she looked at the half stick of chewing gum, and she looked down at the plate of food. And she paused, and then she took out her half stick of chewing gum again, and she picked it up and she said, pour vous. She gave it to him. A well-dressed, well-fed, well-cared-for American GI, she gave away her most precious possession. That's my most wonderful Christmas story. I've had wonderful Christmases in my life, but Nicole and Phelps just touched the Christmas spirit. Well, then I was in Marseille for a while, and then after we left Marseille, we had a few days vacation. They let us go to Cannes for a while, and we had a wonderful time at the Riviera. And then we came back to Paris. And then I was assigned to Mourmelon, France, which is outside of Reims, and had a very interesting time while I was in Mourmelon. And then my next assignment was in Paris, north of Munich, and I've forgotten the name of the town I went to in Munich up there. But then I had the gem of post given to me. I was sent to Garmisch-Partenkirchen, which is in the heart of the Bavarian Alps. It's way, way down in the south of Germany. It's just heaven on earth. And and I was the only Red Cross worker there. So I had to run the whole establishment. You'll be interested in this. We had an American Red Cross Jeep there. And you know how those navigator planes where they had the plexiglass covered so that the navigator could look out and see? Well, there was a plane being dismantled, and they sent one of those plexiglass covers over to the Red Cross and said maybe we could cut it up and use it for something in Red Cross. So instead of cutting it up and using it for something in Red Cross, I asked the motor pool to come and get it. And the motor pool took it back to the motor pool, and I asked them to cut it right down the center and put one half on each side of the Jeep. So we had storm windows. So we were the only we were the only American Red Cross Jeep that had side windows. But I can't tell you, I was just telling somebody else, one time I was coming back from somewhere, and I was in the Munich Bahnhof, which is the railroad station, and there were 3 GIs ahead of me with cigarettes, and three German men started following them. And those GIs knew just what they were doing as those men followed them. Just before they got to the door of the railroad station, the GIs threw their cigarettes up in the air. Those German men were on the ground groveling for those cigarettes. It just took my heart out, you know, to think they had to lose their dignity to grovel for those cigarettes, and to think the GIs were playing them for that. That bothered me. But anyhow, there's nobody in the world like the American GI. He's the most noble. He's also the most devious. When I was in Murmelan, many of the men had a dog, and one day the general thinks he's running the thing, but the GIs are running the thing. So a notice went out at 0800 hours the next day. All dogs are being cleared from the post. So when we went from the Red Cross to go over to the officers' mess for lunch, there isn't a dog in sight. And usually all the dogs are tied up in front of the GI mess so they can come out and feed them. There's not a dog barking anywhere. So when we got back to the Red Cross that day, we called over to the post office and said, "Where are the dogs?" They said, "Don't worry. We've got them all locked up in the GI club, and we'll shut them out tomorrow." The GI is the most devious, but he's also the most ingenious. There's just nothing he won't do for you. And he also drives you stark raving mad. But I must say, as an American Red Cross worker, I was happy to be a part of the military. And all you had to do was, you notice I wore my dog tags because I wanted you to see those. All you had to do was remember your dog tag numbers. If it were captured, you said your name, your rank and serial, and that's what you did. But I must say, I don't think I can ever repay the American Red Cross for that experience that I had the 2 years that I was overseas. It was just, I have hundreds of stories I could tell you. I got to Dachau. I also got the Nuremberg trials. I had several days leave time, so I drove up to Nuremberg, and that was scary. That was real scary. You had to go to the Palace of Justice first to get permission to go to the trials, and they gave you certificates to get in. As you walked through the hall where they were setting the trials, every wall was sandbagged from ceiling to floor. They were so afraid it might be damaged. And then you went upstairs and you sat in a tiered balcony, and you dialed on the seat next to you the language you spoke. And all the proceedings that took place were in your language then. Seated down in front of us were the people who were the record keeping. Over on this side were the men who were being tried, and behind each one there was an American constabulary. And then over on this side were the judges. And straight ahead of us was a plywood wall that had small openings, and those were where the interpreters were, and they were listening to everything that was going on. So the Nuremberg trials was also something. But I don't know what else I can tell you, except to say that there were 5 of us who were very, very together, 5 Red Cross workers. 2 of us have died, and 3 of us are still alive. 2 were from the New York area, 2 from Ohio, and then me from Rochester. And we reunioned every year. Last 2 years, the last time we hadn't reunioned, but we reunioned frequently and just talk about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming in. I think we're about out of time.
Well, I just have one.
I have
When
one
you
other
said-
thing I want.
When you said you were, traveling around, when you said you were traveling around, I mean, were you armed or did you?
No.
How did you?
We were never that close to the front. We were always behind. There were field, station, and general hospitals, and I was always at station hospitals or general hospitals. The field hospitals were the personnel who went out closer to the fighting lines. The American Red Cross Clubmobile people went close to the fighting lines. They could take the clubmobiles up as far as they would allow them to, and they'd have food and refreshments for the GIs. But the field station hospitals were fairly near, but not close. Let me put it that way. When we traveled, we always traveled in American utility of some sort. You might be in a big truck today. You might be the only person sitting on the back of a truck while two GIs in the front were driving you somewhere. You might be, like when we had the children come from the orphan asylum, you lined them all up in an ambulance and brought them there. Oh, when I was at Garmisch, we used to take the men up to the Zugspitze, which is the highest mountain in Germany, and we used to take them up there on a day's trip, and we'd always take them over in ambulances to get on the cog rail. But we always traveled, they always made it possible for us to have some transportation. And then usually at Red Cross headquarters, in any installation, there was one Jeep. And usually there were a whole score of workers, and that meant using the Jeep, whenever you could get it. But when I got to Garmisch, I was the only Red Cross worker there, so I didn't have to share it with anybody. And I wouldn't have minded sharing it with anybody, but it was nice to have it to myself and to be able to do it. But did we travel? We traveled. We also traveled on the metro, the subway in Paris, to go back and forth to the hospital where I worked when I was in Paris. I had to go on the metro. I was just telling Merritt downstairs that I learned to say quel âge, which in French means how old, because I always talked to all the children I saw on the metro. And so I'd always turn to the parent and I'd say quel âge, just as though I knew French, just as though I was of course I wasn't. And I would always ask the age of the child, and that always pleased the person. They thought I was fluent in French because I could do that, but I wasn't fluent in French at all. But I hope I've shared some of the stuff with you. I did want to show you my Afghan.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
You're going to have to help me.
Okay.
Now, the Junior Red Cross in the United States made one of these for every single one who was overseas. And once we got to Paris, this was my Afghan that was given to me. This traveled all over the ETO with me. It went wherever I went. And you can see it's beginning to wear out. See? But I will never give it up. I'll keep it as long as I can. And this Afghan has a lot of stories to tell. A lot of places it's been. And then I wanted to tell you, I also got to Dachau, the concentration camp, and saw it when it was, they have a new book out about the Dachau concentration camp, but it's all cleaned up now and looks nice for people to visit. We saw it when it was raw. I saw it there. And I also want to tell you that the Red Cross has done some things in the city talking about their services to the military, and I've gone with them. And invariably there is somebody who says to me, but the Red Cross charged my husband for donuts and coffee, and the Salvation Army didn't. So then I'd say to them, what war was your husband in? It's World War II. Not in the Salvation Army wasn't there in World War II. He must have been in World War I, because the Salvation Army was there in World War I. But World War II, only the American Red Cross was allowed to go over. That was decided in Congress that they would no longer allow so many different civilian groups to go over, and that only the Red Cross could go. So it was, and the Red Cross didn't charge it. They did charge in the open cities when the men had leave time and could go into the clubs and get showers and stay all night on a nice clean bed. But we never charged for a thing in the hospitals. There were no charges for anything. So we had to clear that up with a lot of people. And when I went over on the George Washington, came home on the Henry Taylor, you never forget the name of the ship. 10 days on the ocean going over, with portholes blacked out, nobody above deck at night. In the daytime we could be above deck, but not at night. And I think it was an easier way to send us overseas than it is the way people are sent overseas today on a plane. You're there, 10 days we had to get used to being away from the US of A and get to know other people. Have I taken too much time?
No, you're fine. Thank you so much for everything.